It's my pleasure now to introduce our next speaker, who will then introduce the panel and our keynote speaker. I've had a pleasure through this process working with Joel Dunn. Joel's been introduced already. Joel's the Executive Director of the Chesapeake Conservancy, and I hadn't worked with him before this event and really have valued both him and his staff. And actually what I'd like to do now is just recognize the staff, because they've done a tremendous amount of work on part of this event. And if they could stand up, those who are in here could stand up. I'd appreciate it. They're up there. They're the folks in the blue shirts and sometimes those green shirts, so thank them for their work as well. I do need to note also that the American Fisheries Society staff have been doing the registration. It was a very big task. A lot of people come in at the last minute, and they worked very hard on that. So if you stop by the registration at some point, do thank them as well for their work. They're here very early, both these mornings, trying to make sure that things go as smoothly as possible. So with that, Joel is going to say a few words and introduce Collin. And Joel, just wanted to thank you for all your work with this and for what I think will be a great working relationship between AFS and you and lots of others in the years ahead.
All right, so first of all, I wanted to thank Doug Austin. Doug was modest in what he said, but American Fisheries Society shouldered half of the burden with the Chesapeake Conservancy in this conference. He backed me up with our effort here in many ways, and he deserves a great amount of thanks to make this event, for making this event happen. So he mentioned I'm the executive director of the Chesapeake Conservancy, and I wanted to just turn your attention to the posters outside. This morning I spent about 20 minutes walking through the posters, and they're phenomenal. They really demonstrate a lot of effort, time, and great science and collaboration. So if you get a chance to take a look at those, I really encourage it. I wanted to sum up yesterday. Yesterday, as Jim mentioned before we left yesterday, the theme for yesterday was really about sort of national leadership, regional coordination, and local implementation. It was really a kind of a vertical concept. Today, it's more horizontal. It's more about across agencies or cross sectors of society and communities. It's about public, private, nonprofit, academic, American Indian communities, urban communities, basically all of the people involved in large landscape conservation. I thought Sid's talk was phenomenal. I wanted to thank him for his leadership, his friendship, his courage, and his guidance. He's been a great coach and friend to me. For the past decade, I've been working here in the Chesapeake Bay, and I've really been following a vision that was created by Pat Noonan, the founder of the Conservation Fund, Gil Grosvenor from National Geographic, and Will Baker from the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, who really wanted to carry out a landscape-scale conservation project here in the Chesapeake Bay, focused on the John Smith Trail and our great rivers in the Chesapeake Bay. Most of our rivers, like the Susquehanna, transcend local, state, federal boundaries. They really offer a perfect framework for conservation. Rivers link people and history and wildlife and ecosystems and cultures, and they demand collaboration between all of these entities, private landowners, conservation organizations. And our nonprofit we're small, we're nimble, but we depend upon partnerships to accomplish our goals along these rivers. We actually pride ourselves on the value we add to these partnerships and the conservation movement. And we've been doing this by fostering collaboration, by generating new data and garnering public support, advocating, certainly fundraising for multiple partners. And the methodology we pursue is really intended to increase the pace of our community's results in conservation. For example, with the National Park Service in the Chesapeake, which is led by Chuck Hunt, their superintendent, we recently launched the Chesapeake Conservation Partnership. It's a large consortium of organizations that are engineered to advance conservation across our 64,000 square mile watershed. And this partnership is really akin to Crown of the Continent. We're really using that as a model in a sense, although there are great differences in community and environment. So our partnership's got its own shape and form. We've also started this thing called the Conservation Innovation Center, and that demonstrates our interest in partnering with industry and corporations, particularly Esri and Intel, to leverage technology for our communities. And all of these partnerships, and this is the crux of my whole point here. All of these partnerships really depend upon courage of all of you to enter into them. Courageous partners are willing to share, they're willing to compromise, they're willing to reduce their grip on the reins of individual popularity, traditional purview and power, to achieve the principles of large landscape conservation and to achieve the land ethic, which I know all of us share. There is an essential element of altruism in identifying joint priorities, sharing resources, and rowing in the same direction. It isn't usually easy, and it takes courage and perseverance. And the Chesapeake has many great rivers, but there's one in the Delmarva Peninsula called the Nanticoke River that really illustrates the value of these partnerships. The Nanticoke is home to Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge, the Harriet Tubman National Monument, the John Smith Trail. It's also the flight path of the Naval Air Force Station, Patuxent River. The Nanticoke region supports 124 rare, threatened, endangered plant and animal species, including the soon-to-be delisted Delmarva fox squirrel. It has an important bird area, it's a Ramsar site, and it serves large and amazingly beautiful concentrations of birds, migratory waterfowl, neotropical birds. It's kind of like our Everglades of the North, if you will. And for more than 2 decades, conservationists have been slowly, thoughtfully protecting land in this region through easements, fee simple purchases along this 50-mile river. And I'm trying to call up a map here to show you some of the previous efforts. You can see some of the green areas that have been protected, particularly along the Maryland-Delaware border there. In 2008, the states of Delaware, Maryland, the Park Service, and the Chesapeake Conservancy entered into a new agreement to concentrate our resources to connect conserved parcels of land and create nearly a continuous conservation corridor from Seaford, Delaware to Vienna, Maryland. And this became increasingly important with the relative sea level rise in the Chesapeake, which is particularly pronounced. Climate change in the Chesapeake is a very challenging issue, and it has heightened the importance of protecting the corridor for migratory pathways for wildlife and plants. So with a $1.25 million grant from a private foundation, $2 million from the state of Delaware, $2 million from the state of Maryland, $1 million from DOD, and millions from Fish and Wildlife Service and Park Service and leverage with partnership with the Conservation Fund and the Nature Conservancy. We're now protecting those lands, and we're linking up those previously protected properties. Each one of these partners really had the courage to persevere with us in collaboration in the face of various forces and factions to accomplish our collective large landscape conservation goals. The Lincoln Institute has also been really supportive of the use of technology in this landscape, so it's a real great partnership model. One of the leaders in our partnership is Collin OMara, who until recently was the Secretary of Natural Resources for the Delaware Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Control. Thanks to Collin, the Nanticoke Conservation Corridor has become one of the best examples of large landscape conservation in the Chesapeake, and I'd argue on the East Coast. It's demonstrated the utility of using the Chesapeake's great rivers and the John Smith Trail as a framework for conservation. So when Collin was appointed to the Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Control in 2009, he was the youngest state cabinet official in the nation. As secretary, he led the largest investment in environmental infrastructure in Delaware's history, $200 million in wastewater and stormwater systems, beach restoration, dam and dike repair, drainage projects, and my favorite, park and wildlife conservation. Prior to his position with Delaware, Collin was the clean tech strategist for the city of San Jose, California. So he's a real expertise in climate. A native of Syracuse, New York. Collin was a Marshall Scholar at the University of Oxford, a University Fellow at the Maxwell School, and a Presidential Scholar at the Dartmouth College. Just this past summer, he was appointed to the National Wildlife Federation, America's oldest and largest wildlife conservation organization, as their president and CEO. So it's my pleasure to introduce to you my friend, Collin OMara.
Good morning. It is great to be with all of you, and I really do appreciate Joel's kind words, but I think he sold himself a little short in the role that the Chesapeake Conservancy played at really bringing some partners together in the Nanticoke and some of these other waterways and beginning to link them to a broader vision of the Chesapeake. And I think that's one of the themes I'm hoping that you'll take away from today, is that as we're thinking about these large landscapes, thinking about how we connect to folks where they are, where they live, and their piece of these bigger landscapes is going to be incredibly important. And the work that Joel was able to do behind the scenes, bringing different partners together to say, you know what, it's not just about the bay itself. It's about, these individuals, it's about Broad Creek, or it's about this part of the Nanticoke, and that's why Delaware should care about this bigger project. Connecting folks to a bigger vision is an incredibly underappreciated skill, and something that I think we all need to be talking about as we're trying to move from having these great visions or these great pilot projects for landscape scale conservation to actual full-blown implementation. I do want to thank Doug and Jim and the entire team for all of their great work to organize today. They're doing amazingly cutting-edge things, and I'm really proud to be a partner in that. And it's just an honor to follow Mr. Jameson as a native of Onondaga County, the Haudenosaunee kind of centerhold, if you will, in Syracuse, New York. It's always an honor to be with them. So again, I'm absolutely thrilled to be here. I'm still living in Delaware, so I'm actually enjoying I actually had a chance to drive down today and see some of the great landscapes that we have been working hard on protecting. And I think the big message I want to try to talk through today is, how do we actually move from these individual pilot projects that we've been talking about for many years? I mean, everyone in this room has been talking about landscape scale conservation for many years now, and making it a much more commonly understood practice and really kind of the vision of what conservation needs to be. And then at the same time, challenge ourselves to think kind of four-dimensionally, thinking about the time elements of climate, and thinking about how these kind of landscapes are much more dynamic than probably we were thinking even 5 to 10 years ago. Beginning planning for the future and what these systems will migrate into and what the habitat needs will be in the future. And then at the same time, I'm going to challenge folks to think a little bit, not just about public lands and large private lands, but talk also about urban and suburban spaces as being important connectors in these larger corridors, particularly the migratory corridors for things like pollinators, songbirds, shorebirds, and the like. And so that's kind of the frame that I'd like to challenge with today. I apologize, I do talk way too quickly. I joke often that growing up in Syracuse, New York, if I didn't speak this quickly, my mouth would actually freeze shut from the saliva for the 6 months in the winter. I did have the good sense to play basketball and not hockey to get out of the freezing cold. But I do think that figuring out ways to connect people to these incredibly important concepts is going to be extremely important in the years ahead. When I was in Delaware, one of the things that I did really pride myself on was the work of our agency, really trying to focus on the landscape scale. And Delaware, for being such a small state, you kind of see a portion of it there in the upper right-hand side of the map, is actually part of 3 kind of amazing watersheds. You have part of the Delaware Bay, the Delaware Basin, the lower part of Delaware Bay, which is one of the most significant parts of the North American flyway. When you think about things like the red-knot horseshoe crab symbiotic relationship, when you think about waterfowl migrations, when you think about a lot of songbirds, more than 400 species call Delaware home. 400 bird species called Delaware home at some point during the year. And so we actually had an Americans Great Outdoors initiative that we worked on with Secretary Salazar, really looking at the 200,000 acres from kind of the canal that kind of bisects Delaware at the top, all the way down to the city of Lewis, which is kind of these 200,000 acres that we call our bayshore. It's some of the most incredible habitat, and it's actually protected because of a law that was put in place by Governor Russell Peterson in 1971 that prevented industrial development in that part of the bay. And so that's the reason we don't look like some of the more industrial parts further up the Delaware, whether it's places like Paulsboro or places even like the Delaware City Refinery or going up into the Pennsylvania part of the Delaware River. So you have this incredibly diverse area of habitats. You have all kinds of all kinds of shore habitats and different types of granular sand. You also get into a bunch of wetland environments, into some upland forests. And so again, many little micro ecosystems all abutted next to each other in a way that's very conducive to many different species enjoying the lands. And the amazing thing is, over a partnership over about 50 years between private groups and public groups and others, over half of the land is publicly protected. But rather than setting out a goal saying, we want to make sure all of it is purchase fee simple, we've been working with landowners very easily in many cases to talk about how conservation practices on private land, using existing programs and hopefully ramping those up, are a way to actually kind of fill out the checkerboard and think through landscape scale conservation in a meaningful way. But one of the most important parts of our Bayshore initiative was actually focusing on the communities that are part of it and actually getting to the history and actually really engaging folks in this. So it's not just a way to kind of set aside land for wildlife or kind of having it kind of to be seen but not touched, but actually thinking about low impact recreation, thinking about the economic benefits of conservation, and really trying to make the case that through a land scale conservation approach, we'll be much more likely to have a greater economic prosperity for the folks that are there because of the incredible resource, because of the potential for ecotourism, because of other types of recreational activities, and using that as a basis for this broader vision and getting buy-in. And so Joel was able to do the exact same thing in the Nanticoke. And the southernmost county in Delaware, Sussex County, has more chickens than any other county in the entire United States. So including the entire, any county in Arkansas or North Carolina or all the places you think of when you think chicken, there are more chickens in Sussex County. And so you can imagine the politics that come from that, right? I mean, so obviously you have a lot of folks fairly libertarian in their ideology, but they love their water bodies, right? They love the state parks that are on Broad Creek or on the Nanticoke. So again, having a vision that connects with folks. I was in Vermont yesterday. They had a little celebration of the Endangered Species Act, and it was sort of a celebration of successes. I mean, obviously they're excited about the lynx and the loons, and they've done some good works with peregrine and osprey, but also kind of talking about the challenges ahead. And one of the things that I talked about is that this idea of place-based conservation for species protection is nothing new, right? We've been talking about habitat scale protection for a long time. Obviously, the big breakthrough, starting with Ding Darling when he ran the Biologic Survey, who was the founder of National Wildlife Federation. But before that, when he was working for President Roosevelt, was kind of talking about the need to protect habitats, not just individual species, kind of talking about the entire ecosystem. And then obviously in the Endangered Species Act itself, we're talking about, again, the ecosystems, the habitat, not just the individual species, understanding this link between the landscape and the species themselves. The challenge that I kind of put out was that when the threats from the Endangered Species Act were really thought about in between 1966, when the first version of the act, and 1973, when the act we all think of was adopted, most of the threats were man-made, right? There were threats that were kind of place-based again. There were toxics in the air, toxics in the water. It was the destruction of habitat. It was things that really kind of bisected or dissected or fragmented or really destroyed these habitat corridors that were really necessary for many of these amazing species. Now, flash forward 40 years, and we still have those threats, right? We're making good progress on some of them, but we're still seeing a lot of fragmentation, a lot of habitat impacts. And the only thing that seems to slow it down is kind of recessions, more so than government policy in most cases. But now we're seeing additional threats around climate. And so the question becomes, when you're thinking about something like, let's use the red knot migration. I'm going to try and stay on the East Coast. I heard Sally Jewell talked a lot about West Coast examples. I'm going to do some East Coast examples today of landscape scale conservation work. Let's think about the red knot migration, right? So you have this incredible intersection with the horseshoe crabs that are coming into Delaware Bay, or on either the New Jersey side or on the Delaware side, sometimes a little bit further up, laying eggs, extremely high densities. The red knots are coming all the way from Terra del Fuego, stopping a few places along the way, one of which being Delaware Bay, eating their eggs for a little bit more energy, kind of doubling their body weight, and then going all the way up into Canada. Now, if you look at sea level rise projections for that part of Delaware Bay, and you assume kind of 1 meter to 1.5 meters of sea level rise in the next few years, about 99% of the coastal wetlands that currently support this amazing diversity that I mentioned earlier will be inundated in some way. Now, obviously, the systems are dynamic. Those systems will move inland, but the upland forests, some of the farmland that are behind them, all of a sudden will become those estuarine mudflats and then the wetlands. So you'll see this impact effect. From a landscape scale point of view, we need to be thinking in terms of time, because there's some serious conversations that need to be had about how we think about acquisition strategies, how we think about conservation easement strategies, how we think about kind of place-based restoration strategies. Because at the end of the day, much of the land that we're trying to protect, even some places that we're working along the Nanticoke and the map you have behind me, are going to be underwater in many years, and then the more critical habitat will actually be that which is behind them. And so how do we start thinking about, it's not just about protecting that tree stand anymore, it's not just protecting this stream segment, it's actually about thinking where that's going to be in the future, which becomes much more complicated from a policy point of view. And now, fortunately, the National Wildlife Federation has some amazing people that have been really leading providing thought leadership in this area for a long time. And all of you know Dr. Bruce Stein and Naomi Edelson. I do encourage you all to attend their session later this afternoon. And they put out an incredible report a few months ago called Climate Smart Conservation. And the idea is to actually be thinking through these dynamic systems at a landscape scale proactively and planning accordingly. Now, this is something that's easy to say, right? And all of us kind of think about this instinctively, but actually doing it on the ground is extremely complicated. And you need to figure out ways to avoid maladaptation. We need to make sure that we're being thoughtful in the way we do it. But it's an incredibly challenging I kind of call it a four-dimensional challenge to think through, where all of a sudden now it's not just about the existing habitat corridor, the migratory corridors, it's what that corridor is going to need to look like as the migration patterns are changing. It's about looking at, what are the natural resource impacts going to be from different climate stressors, and how is that going to affect different species and different ecosystems, and then kind of planning for the future. And that could be everything from kind of accelerating the movement of some habitats, moving coastal impoundments in further, so all of a sudden you can protect that little freshwater spot, or have that kind of brackish environment that you might need a little earlier so you're more resilient. It might mean having things like living shorelines and dune lines and having additional sediment going into wetland systems, try to build up their strength so they can be preserved a little bit more. It might be thinking about not necessarily conserving the land along the water body, but actually trying to have some additional protections or some rights to the farmland or the community behind it. These are very, very complicated questions to be thinking through. So it's not just as simple as, if we just kind of protect this area in some way, or we have good conservation practices in this area, we'll be fine. These systems are going to change. So whether you're talking about mule deer or sage grouse out west, you're talking about, shorebirds or waterfowl on the East Coast, or everything in between, these are the kind of conversations we need to start having. Now, the challenge we all face is there's a translational challenge. It's hard enough to try to explain, particularly in this kind of age we're in with kind of the ideology increasingly on the right, attacking kind of public lands and the public trust doctrine, to also have this conversation about how these conservation practices, particularly on private land, need to be thinking in this kind of longer term fashion. And so I do encourage you during the panel today to be challenging yourself to think about, well, how does this apply if we're thinking about climate stressors in every different type of landscape that we're thinking about across the country? It's a huge challenge, but it's also a huge opportunity. We're very blessed right now at the National Wildlife Federation to be working very closely with the Fish and Wildlife Service on several projects that are really trying to demonstrate this kind of climate resilience, this kind of climate smart conservation. One of the things that I'm really excited about, and I'm not sure Secretary Jewell talked about it yesterday from what I've heard, but Interior was actually very strategic working with NWFLLC on the projects they selected for the Sandy funds that were given to them for state and local projects. We're actually in the middle of 3 of them right now that I'm really excited about. One is a project in the Great Marsh. It's the largest estuary in New England, kind of the Ipswich and Newburyport area as you're kind of going from Boston up to Portsmouth. Really doing some great work trying to make that entire system more resilient, removing invasives, building up the marsh, actually doing some nourishment work, as well as a lot of mapping and kind of what the hydrology of the wetland system will look like over time, and making sure we're kind of planning accordingly, and then also engaging the local communities. There's 6 communities there that are really dependent on having a healthy estuary for protection of recreation, really the basis of their economy. So a really, really exciting project, again, at a significant scale. You have the Baker Wildlife Refuge right there. There's some other really incredible assets. But again, a project that, if done well, could really be replicable and scalable in other places. We're doing a lot of work right now with impoundments. We're also doing a lot of work in Delaware and New Jersey, looking at where the impoundment needs are, where we actually should have some managed retreat, where we should have some additional sediment put in to actually build up some of these systems. But again, very, very thoughtful projects that hopefully will be replicable and scalable across the country. So that's kind of like my pitch, so please do. And my commitment is that if you attend Bruce and Naomi's speech today, or session today, you will actually get a copy of this nice, wonderful book in the flesh. You won't have to look at the PDF anymore. It is worth having a copy of. This is an incredible book. And actually, the president recently, when he was rolling out the CEQ's kind of adaptation strand for land and water, actually referenced this work several times. And we're really grateful to all the federal partners we have here that have been working on integrating this. I just can't say enough about the work of the Park Service, the Fish and Wildlife Service, the Forest Service, NOAA, USGS, and others that have been really engaged in this work, EPA, of course, and the Army Corps. But again, these projects that we're working on, really trying to find ways to put concept and theory into practice on the ground, so we have something that you can point to that we can replicate and scale. And I should have mentioned before, we're also doing a lot of work with the Army Corps. And there are, obviously there's always challenges given the largesse that is the Army Corps. But, at least working with the Philadelphia district in particular, I had some great experiences really working with the team that were trying to find natural infrastructure solutions in ways that were much more resilient, much more ecologically friendly, and also just providing great services, and also at the end of the day, more effective than just another seawall or another hardened infrastructure piece. And we actually put out a report a couple days ago at the National Wildlife Federation, kind of looking at our natural defenses and really making this case for why natural infrastructure is the preferred option, or should be the preferred option, both from a cost point of view and also from an effectiveness point of view. But again, how that fits into a landscape scale conservation conversation is going to be extremely important in the years ahead. The last thought I want to leave folks with is around how we think about kind of the connections between where people live versus the landscapes that we're often talking about. Fewer and fewer people are living on these landscapes, right? As we urbanize, as we have more folks moving into cities, we are going to have more and more folks kind of disconnected from the land. And one of the challenges that we all face from a policy point of view is when folks are disconnected from the land, obviously they're less involved in advocacy and kind of promotion of this land ethic, as Joel called it, that we all hold so dear. But at the same time, there are ways to re-engage. And so often when we think about these big landscapes, we kind of treat the cities as either black spots or places where we should just focus on the public lands, right? The city park or maybe some kind of other big open space. But I would challenge this group to think very carefully over the next few days about how we engage folks in their own backyards on their individual properties. A lot of times folks will kind of scoff at like backyard habitat programs, and obviously the National Wildlife Federation has arguably the best, and at least that's the biggest certified wildlife habitat program in the country, with almost 200,000 participants and thousands of schools and many others. And often it's kind of been seen as kind of a gimmicky program to try to encourage folks to maybe think a little bit about conservation, but we've actually really significantly underappreciated the conservation value that backyard habitat provides. There was actually a great column the other day by Sir David Attenborough, who many of you know has been a leading thinker on many of these issues for many years, basically saying we can never underestimate the impact of these individual actions at scale across these amazing urban areas. And if you talk to folks at like the Cornell Ornithological Society, the places that have done a lot of work on backyard habitat are becoming hotspots for stopovers, as well as the bigger parks and the bigger parcels that folks typically think of in more urban environments. This kind of work is going to be increasingly important in the years ahead. And so, we're actually going to be shifting our program fairly substantially, trying to make it much more conservation focused. So rather than just getting a little sign, we really want to have folks kind of move up the conservation ladder, doing more than just planting a few native plants, but actually having more sustainable practices, but also thinking about which native species in their area would be most helpful to the conservation needs that we have in each part of the country. Now, obviously on the East Coast and in the Central Flyway, place like that, monarchs are going to be a big piece of this challenge. Right, we're looking at a 90% decrease in the monarch population in the last 40 years. We know that milkweed is a necessary piece of that equation. We've had impacts from pesticide use in Mexico. We've had losses of significant habitat in agricultural lands and other kind of large landscapes. But we're also not seeing enough habitat in urban areas. And so one of the things we'll be working on is trying to think through how we connect these corridors, almost as stepping stones, if you will. Really trying to think through how each part of the landscape can contribute to this more robust wildlife habitat, so we're all kind of doing our part. And the benefits are really twofold. The first is the conservation benefit, as I mentioned, whether that's for pollinators or songbirds or amphibians or obviously other pollinators like monarchs. But there's also a way to connect folks back with nature in a way that actually makes this more real and these conversations much more appealing. This is the final thought I'll leave you with. Landscape scale conservation in this country is still too abstract a concept for the average family. If I think about my parents up in Syracuse, New York, and I talk about, these are what we're thinking for the entire Finger Lakes region. This is why what's going on in the Susquehanna makes sense, into the Chesapeake. Or these are how these pieces fit together. They get it, right? I mean, they're exceptionally intelligent people, and they're, very, very civically minded. But you start connecting to what they can do as individuals. All of a sudden, there's a level of investment there that really creates an energy and a momentum that you can build upon. And so, as great as it is to talk about, the multiple hundred or multiple thousand or even tens of thousand acre parcels and practices and things like that, actually figuring out ways to engage folks at scale is going to be extremely important. And so I'm really excited about the backyard habitat work. I do think that, Naomi will be talking about this later today. I do think it's a way that we can connect the work to connect people back to nature. We often think of kind of nature being there and people being here. We need to kind of actually blur those lines and actually bring people back to nature in a meaningful way if we're going to have a conservation ethic in this country, the resources, the political support, the actual manpower, the firepower, if you will, to actually do the kind of things that we've been talking about at scale across the entire country. The challenges that we face are many. The landscapes that are incredible. There are incredible opportunities. The species that depend on these landscapes need our help. I quote somewhere between the Lorax and Ding Darling in all my speeches that we need to speak for wildlife because they can't speak for themselves. And at the end of the day, the work that you're all doing is incredibly important to advancing that cause. And I do encourage you to think about how do we connect it to people and how do we keep it focused on wildlife? Because if we do those things, the coalitions we can build around this kind of work will make us unstoppable to any forces that may oppose us. Thank you very much for having me today.
So I'm going to invite you to ask any question you have of Collin. You can ask it very slowly, and he'll answer at his own speed. So anything that you want to comment or ask now, and then we will, as we're doing that, if the next panel wants to come up, then we'll be ready for you.
Yes.
I'll just stand up so other people can hear me a little better as well. I was very interested in what you said about the monarchs because I followed that as an issue. And when I see what the advice is to people with ordinary backyards and how they can help, all I'm seeing is wet milkweed. And the way you do that is you're supposed to go out by the roadsides and find milkweed plants and gather the seeds. And I think, I would probably let milkweed on my acreage as much as I could. But, going to the roadside, milkweed's either in or out the person or from our family. So, is there another way to help the average person get milkweed seeds to plant if there's money?
So the question was about the monarch population, how individuals can get involved, and the question was really around the difficulty in many cases of actually finding native milkweed to plant in their backyard, other than having to go to the roadside to try to find some seeds at the end of the year. The Fish and Wildlife Service is very interested in actually figuring out better distribution methods. The Monarch Partnership's trying to figure out different ways. We're engaged in that as well, and so we are trying to connect folks that are producing seed with folks that are looking for it. I mean, it is a market opportunity on the economic side. And so we are trying to connect those dots, but I agree it's too hard right now. And it's something that we are very focused on because over the next several months, you'll hear us talking more about migratory corridors. You'll hear us talking more about pollinators with some particular focus on native bees and on monarchs. And so that will be one thing we'll have more and more information coming out about.
Any others? All right. Let's thank Collin for what there. I'm sorry, there is one. Pardon me, right there.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. The question was about how politics can often influence, these kind of planning efforts and, distort things in different ways, and any recommendations from my experience. I'm a big fan of meeting people where they are. It's so often that NGOs, and not to be critical of some of my colleagues from the national groups, but we're so often telling people what they should think as opposed to trying to meet them where they are and kind of really think about how the things that we're talking about are things we care about connect to the things they care about. And I think, and I'll get back to some of Joel's work with the Conservancy. Sussex County, Delaware is a very conservative place. You could put this county in the middle of a very southern state and it would fit in very well in terms of the politics. And at the end of the day, though, they love their waterway. They love the fact that they can, go out fishing. They love the fact that there's some tourism that comes from that. They love, the state parks that are there, the camping opportunities. And so they love the resource, regardless of political affiliation. And so all of a sudden, but a lot of them could care less about the Chesapeake Bay. They never get there. Maybe they go off a rock fishing a couple times a year, but that's kind of their experience. They care about the river. And so if you make it more place-based, that kind of depoliticize the issue, and then also talk about the economic benefits, I think all of a sudden then you're in a very different type of conversation. So it's not just the conservation community wants this, it's that the local community wants this. Much easier said than done, though. And I think the work that it takes to take go from the kind of the planning phases and all the great GIS layers that we're looking at and all the data that are driving our decisions, compared to the way the local folks, they're just trying to put food on the table. They're just trying to figure out how to pay for their kid to go to college or school. They're just trying to figure out how to make life work. Connecting it to the things they care about is the only way you're going to break through, and it's the only way to transcend the politics.
All right, well then, thank you.